Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, we've been on quite a journey over the last 2 years, and techies, data analysts, and healthcare professionals are all increasingly using technology and data to try and be better prepared should another pandemic ever come our way. And hopefully, of course, they never will be. But if we have learned anything from the last 2 years, it's better to expect the unexpected and be better prepared. I recently came across an initiative called Epiverse, led by DataDotOrg, which has co-created distributed data analysis tools, all with the goal of trying to get ahead of the next global health crisis. And they do this with an inclusive open source software ecosystem that's led by an interdisciplinary community of experts that are driving equitable innovation in infectious disease responses. So I wanted to learn more about their mission to build a global open source community dedicated to preventing, detecting and responding to the next possible health crisis. But most importantly, the technology behind it all, and how humans and technology could work together to be better prepared. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way stateside, where today I'm going to be speaking with Danil Mikhailov, who's going to be sharing his story and a mission that they're on. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about your journey, how you got here, and your origin story for everyone listening and hearing about you for the first time?
Well, first of all, hi, Neil. Thank you so much for having me. It's really good to talk to you on the show. So my origin story started in the sector over 20 years ago. I have always had an interest both in technology and in social sciences and humanities. So from the very beginning, I started kind of looking at things from those two perspectives and very much enjoyed that contrast. So my first degree, for example, was in computer science, but then soon after I did a master's in anthropology and Chinese studies. So that gives you a flavor, and I've kind of continued in that vein for the rest of my career, working in that intersection of technology and the human side of things. The last 10 years in particular have been focused on health tech and health data issues. I was working at the Wellcome Trust and leading the Wellcome Data Labs, a team I founded and then led, which is an interdisciplinary team of data scientists, social scientists, looking at how to use technology to solve the issues Wellcome Trust is interested in, and they're a massive global health charity. And then, of course, for the last year and a bit, I've been executive director of DataDotOrg. Really, privileged and honored to have joined DataDotOrg right from the beginning when they were just forming, because they're a really interesting and rare organization. They are a platform for partnerships, so they're fundamentally designed to bring people together, which I like. They connect technologists and technology company with academics, with funders, all in the pursuit of building up the field of data science for social impact. So how do you help solve some of the biggest social challenges in the world by applying technology and data science? So that's my journey in a quick summary.
And that's one of the reasons I invited you on the podcast today, because one of the big mantras we always say at the end of every episode is technology works best when it brings people together. And so much has changed over the last 2 years. So just to set the scene for our conversation today, what would you say was missing in the global data sharing when the COVID-19 pandemic began? And also, has anything changed since then? And are there any remaining gaps still 2 years later?
Well, goodness, that was, I remember those early days when we first realized something was happening in Wuhan in China. So what was missing at the time when COVID hit was although the scientific community have warned for many years that a significant infectious disease threat was out there and there's a potential of a pandemic, those, I think, warnings weren't necessarily heeded enough by either governments or corporations or other organizations. So we didn't have, a system for surveillance, for keeping watch on potential rising infections, which have a potential to become pandemics. We had problems with data. I was remembering very clearly some of the issues we had early on in my role in Wellcome, trying to help basically engineer infrastructure to connect data together when the pandemic was raging, because we all realized, data was either missing or it was in silos, unconnected to each other. And just the processes for analyzing data took too long. I mean, traditionally, if you do, for example, a clinical trial, it would take a couple of years for the data to be analyzed and published in the kind of traditional academic system. Of course, in a pandemic, that is amazingly too long. So we were desperately trying to accelerate that and squeeze that 2 years into a couple of weeks, which we managed to do. But of course, the lesson there was, don't try to fix the system during the pandemic. Make sure it is done correctly beforehand. So data is definitely one. The other couple of examples of things that were definitely not there are the tools themselves, the tools used to analyze the data, to make the kind of modeling predictions that we all see almost every day in our newspapers about what will happen with the virus. Those tools were there, but they were kind of a cottage industry. So typically, each academic team of folks on epidemiology would create their own software in R or Python or something similar in order to run those models. And of course, that means there's inconsistency, lack of standards, accuracy sometimes wasn't there, and problems with reproducibility. So all of that again became very, very acutely obvious to everyone that that's not the best way to act when the pandemic hit. And finally, the third element I would bring up of what were the gaps is comes from that human element. There was just not enough collaboration and cooperation. A lot of the efforts against the pandemic, kind of in epidemiology, were focused on the global north. Low and middle income countries just didn't have enough investment to build their own capacity in that space. So I think that's another third gap. And all three of those gaps persist, to your point of what is happening at the moment. We've made big improvements in all three areas, but to some degree, all three gaps are persisting, which is, of course, where our work at DataDotOrg comes in to try and continue to help improve things.
And from there, how did the idea of Epiverse come about, and what were you setting out to accomplish, and how do you say it's different from other pandemic preparedness initiatives that we're beginning to see now?
Epiverse is a global collaborative, so it is a program that brings together academic teams, technologists, funders, and many other organizations across the world to create tools for the epidemiology community. So basically replacing all of those kind of bespoke hand-coded tools that epidemiologists use beforehand with a single set of standardized, open, and free-to-use tools, which can be made available to everyone and everywhere. So that's what Epiverse is trying to achieve. It is setting that kind of global standard for creating software. How it's different is it's not just focusing on the software. There are many programs, as you said, about preparedness, and in many cases they focus on the technology. What Epiverse is trying to do is, in addition to funding the tools, it's funding the creation of a community. So as much effort is being made on community building and partnerships as on the technology aspects. It's also important for us that we fund the creation of these tools in the low and middle income countries in order to build up that capacity, to my earlier point. So a lot of the work on Epiverse will be happening not in San Francisco or London or Boston, but in the Gambia, for example, where we're working with the MSc Gambia unit, or in Colombia, where we're working with a couple of excellent universities. So we're trying to make sure, A, we're funding software, B, that software is funded and created in low and middle income countries to build that capacity, and C, we're building a community around that.
I'm curious. It's incredibly cool what you're doing here. So what would you say, what insights can privacy-preserving technology unlock? What would the potential for securely unlocking privately held data? And what would it ultimately mean for the field of epidemiology? I appreciate I've just sent you 3 questions there, but I'm very, very curious on how you're going to do this.
No problem, Neil. So among the tools we're building in Epiverse, some of the tools are about unlocking new data types. And let me explain why that is important. So I mentioned at the start that there were a lot of issues with data at the beginning of the pandemic, whether data was missing, whether it was locked in silos, and that those problems persist. There are many countries in the world where you don't have good official health records. And where they exist, they might not be digitized, so they're hard to access. So often we need access to additional data sources in order to fill those gaps of kind of more traditional health data. So, for example, you might want access to mobility data to show how populations are moving. You might need access to financial data to see what people are spending money on, what they're buying across the counter. So, for example, if we see a spike in the purchase of anti-fever medication, that could be a proxy signal that there's another spike in the pandemic. So that kind of non-traditional health data sources are very important to plug the gaps where more traditional health data may not be available. So part of Epiverse, some of the tools within our program is very much designed to, via privacy-preserving way, unlock those non-traditional data sources. We're working with a number of great companies to find a way of unlocking those sources of data and show that the current privacy-preserving technologies, whether it's differential privacy, homomorphic encryption, etc., have now matured enough that you can both unlock data safely without compromising the privacy, and at the same time retain enough signal in that data for epidemiologists to do their modeling successfully. So that's what we're trying to achieve, and that's how it will help the field of epidemiology. It will give it that extra valuable data resource that is currently missing.
And I'm curious, how challenging is it to connect those previously siloed areas of information sharing? Because although it sounds very easy, it's possibly the biggest challenge out there, isn't it? And connecting all those dots.
Yeah, no, 100%. You're exactly right. That is a big challenge. And we can only have a hope of success by working together. So instead of doing kind of a narrow approach where a single organization is trying to unlock data for its own project, we need to build global infrastructure. And that's where entities like the World Health Organizations are crucial. So we're working closely in DataDotOrg with the World Health Organization because we need their ability to connect governments together, to connect, so for example, ministries of health across the world, who will be the end users of those tools. So that kind of connection and collective effort is really important to this. The other thing I would say, which is important, is you need to build trust and retain trust. And that means, again, focusing on the human, not just the technology. So one way in which we are doing it is we are applying the principles of co-design. So when we are building tools, or unlocking data sets, or indeed building new infrastructure, we're doing it with the communities that will be using those tools. So applying good principles of kind of informing our design by the needs of the users. And that only works if you build those tools on the ground where they're needed, which is another reason to make sure that you are building tools in, for example, the low and middle income countries. It's not just about equity, it's also about the effectiveness of those tools, making sure they're designed and tested with the end users in mind.
And how would you say Epiverse is different from other open source ecosystems? And maybe just to bring that all to life, what does that global co-creation look like within the ecosystem? Is there any way you can bring that to life with maybe an example?
Sure. So, first of all, how it's different is that we're focusing not just on technology, but on the community. Yeah. I mentioned that briefly at the start, but to expand it a little bit, what does that actually mean? It means we are investing in, for example, full-time community managers. So individuals whose job it is to actually look after community cohesion, community needs, it also means we're investing in, for example, in events and conferences. So people who are contributing to that tool creation from across the world, for example, whether it's Colombia or the Gambia or indeed London, UK, can come together, can share insights. So it is about making sure that you're focusing on the people and not just the technology. So that's one key way in which we are different from many other projects. And the reason that's important, by the way, is that it ensures sustainability for the open source program. One of the biggest problems in open source is that when the funding is there, it works. When the funding is removed, it's very difficult to sustain for the longer term. So original projects don't often have a long life cycle in front of them. By making sure we approach it in that community building way, we remove single points of failure. So we always have multiple contributors, multiple funders, and if in any area one of them drops out, which is entirely natural, there are others to take up the work, and the work doesn't stop. So that's one of the reasons this kind of community focus is so important for longer-term sustainability of open source projects.
And one of the other things that really stood out for me is how you're maintaining and cultivating your community of contributors. So can you expand on how you're doing that too?
Yeah, so we are planning a number of events to bring them together. We are planning to make sure that we invest in things like documentation. We are planning to tell stories of their work, just to make sure we showcase successes, which is very important. Another challenge we're trying to solve is a blocker in this kind of contribution, often in academia, is that software developers in academia typically don't get the credit they deserve for their work, because the whole academic system is predicated on publishing scientific papers. That's how you get promoted. That's how you get funding. So often people who contribute code or for example, do data work don't have the same kind of incentives to continue. So one of the things we're doing is working with our funder partners and others to understand how can we change incentives in the academic system, so we recognize the contribution of coders, software developers, designers, data scientists in academia. So all of those levers are all designed to make sure that community is sustainable.
How is Epiverse working towards equity in global health? Is that something you can expand on too?
Yes, absolutely. So we already talked about how it's important to build communities where they're needed across the world rather than focusing only on the global north.
Yeah.
So expanding that idea, it's also important who is working on building the tools in those communities. So we make sure in our projects that we have both gender diversity and racial diversity at every level of the program. So the designers, the software developers, we are very, very keen to make sure that there is equal representation there. Why is it important? Because fundamentally people bring different life experiences and perspectives. They ask different questions. So if all of your software developers are, frankly, white men in their 20s, then there's a whole lived experience that is missed. Certain questions never get asked. And that makes fundamentally for worse software at the end. So for us, it's very important both where the software development is being carried out, but also by whom, to make sure we have that diverse pool of data scientists, software developers. And we're very lucky in that space. We have such great leaders. For example, in the MIC Gambia, we have Dr. Babukar Bar, who is leading that effort. We have great female scientists working for us, both in London and in Colombia. So that lens of equity, as I said before, is important not just for the sake of equity, but also for the sake of effectiveness, i.e. better software is fundamentally created in that way.
Well, you've accomplished so much in a short amount of time. It's incredibly inspiring. But I also know this is just the beginning for you guys. So where do you go from here? What's your overall grand vision for Epiverse?
Well, indeed, the team have made amazing progress so far, and we're only a few months into it. The vision for us is, well, first of all, for the epidemiological use case of Epiverse, which is its first and initial focus. We want to continue expanding the community. So we want to bring in more contributors from across the world. So we're currently having, for example, conversations with universities in Peru, universities in India who want to join the collaborative. We also want to make sure that we connect with governments and ministries of health. And that's where our collaboration with the World Health Organization is so important. We also have great support from a number of governments. For example, we were one of the official programs approved by the G7 in their kind of pandemic prevention plan. So those kind of connections with governments are important because it's about delivery of the products. So we don't only want to make great software, we want to make sure the products are actually used and are effective. And often it is, officials, policymakers in the ministries of health of particular countries that make decisions based on the models that the software produces. So those kind of collaborations we are keen to continue to expand. And this is about epidemiology, but longer term, even than that, we want to see Epiverse as a blueprint for how to do these kind of open software projects in other areas, other sectors. So we're beginning to talk, for example, with a number of organizations about doing something similar in the area of financial inclusion. So can we identify a similar kind of gap we did for in epidemiology in the financial data space? And can we also do something similar, bring different organizations together, create software in this co-design way, and build communities around its support. So I think the future for us in the longer term is almost deriving a new way of building software and supporting it for the longer term.
Well, it's such exciting and incredibly important work that you're doing here. So I'll be following you very closely. It'd be great to get you back on. Yeah, it'd be great to get you back on later in the year or next year and find out how that journey is progressing. But we're now at the fun part of the podcast where I'm going to ask you to leave everyone listening with a bit of inspiration. Maybe share a book that has inspired you or important to you, and we'll add it to our Amazon wish list. Is there anything that springs to mind?
Sure. Well, I was thinking about this question, and I'm one of those people who read multiple books at the same time. So I usually have by my bedside table 2 or 3 books open, but one of them really jumped out. So there's a book by Jim Al-Khalili called The House of Wisdom. And I think it's really relevant for this conversation. It actually is a book about the history of science. It's talking about the great contribution to science made by Arab scientists back in the 8th and 9th centuries AD. So around what was called the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And the reason it's relevant is a lot of the concepts we're talking about, like, for example, algorithms, actually are drawn from that period. So algorithm, the name, was derived from the name of one of the great mathematicians of the era called Al-Khwarizmi, who invented many of algebraic, for example, innovations that we still use to this day. So it's useful, I think, to remember that although we talk about a lot of the innovation currently being locked in the global north, and via programs like Epiverse, we're trying to make sure that low and middle income countries and indeed countries from across the world build their own centers of excellence in creating software. But it's useful to remember that 1,000 years ago, that was not the case. 1,000 years ago, innovation was happening across the world, much more equally spread, and there were centers of excellence like in Baghdad, in the 8th and 9th centuries AD, where many of the concepts in mathematics and statistics we use to this day were actually created. So I recommend this book, The House of Wisdom by Jim Al-Khalili.
Awesome. I learned something there too. I'm going to have to check that out. And for everyone listening that would just like to find out more information about everything that we've talked about today, or maybe even contact your team if they've got any questions or want to carry that conversation on, what's the best starting point?
Well, our website is easy to find. We are DataDotOrg. So that should be the first port of call. We're trying to build up on that website a whole set of free resources for the community to use as well, quite beyond epidemiology. So please go to data.org.
Data.org. How did you secure that domain name?
we were very lucky. I mean, DataDotOrg was co-founded by the Rockefeller Foundation and Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, and they were able to procure that domain name from the One campaign, who are great friends and collaborators of us. So yes, we're lucky to have it, and we're trying to do it justice by making sure it's the place online for data science and social impact. So we keep adding great free resources for the community to use on that domain name.
What a great story too. And I love listening to you today and hearing about DataOrg's Epiverse initiative and how you're working to address gaps in the data sharing ecosystem by ultimately bringing together these interdisciplinary community of experts in order to build, deploy and scale innovative solutions. Incredibly cool, incredibly inspiring. I meant what I said. We'll stay in touch. It'll be great to get you back on. But more than anything, thank you for sharing that story with me today.
Thanks so much, Neil. It's so great to speak to you and look forward to coming back again.
Food for thought indeed there. And I'd love to know your thoughts, especially if you're working in this industry, whether it be around data, technology, healthcare, pandemic response, whatever it might be. If you've got an opinion on anything we've discussed today, I'd love to hear it. So email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. Send your thoughts over. Let me know your experiences with this. And tomorrow we're going to tackle a completely separate topic. We try and get a different discussion point every single day. And I've got another great one lined up for you. So before I reveal any spoilers, just a big thank you for listening from me. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.